Stream is now live.
Mr. Chairman, we are live and recording, and you may gavel in the meeting when ready.
Thank you. Good morning. The open meeting of the Federal Election Commission for September 19th, 2024 will come to order. We have a special motion today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the Commission consider a proposed referral of questions on dependent care to Regulations Committee, and that the Commission determine, pursuant to 11 CFR 2.7D1, that business so requires and no earlier public announcement was possible.
Thank you. All those in favor of the Vice Chair's motion, please say aye. Aye. All right, that motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much. We have a very full agenda today, so we'll get right to it. Our first item is Draft Advisory Opinion 2024-09. Request from U.S. Representative Minette Barragan. We have Ms. Wenziger here from the Office of General Counsel, and I see counsel for the requester, Ms. Olson, here to answer any questions that we might have. Let me turn it over to Mr. Wenziger for a presentation on this AO request.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, Commissioners. Before you are agenda documents 2437A and 2437B, draft advisory opinions responding to a request by Congresswoman Minette Barragan in her principal campaign committee, Barragan for Congress. The requesters ask whether campaign funds may be used to pay certain elder care expenses incurred in a variety of scenarios by Congresswoman Barragan as the primary caretaker of her mother. Both drafts conclude that campaign funds may be used to pay certain elder care expenses Congresswoman Barragan incurs when traveling for her own campaign, because the expenses would not exist irrespective of the campaign, and therefore the payment of the expenses with campaign funds would not be personal use. Draft A further concludes that campaign funds may be used to pay certain elder care expenses Congresswoman Barragan incurs in a variety of scenarios when she's away from home for activities directly connected to her duties as a federal office holder, because the expenses would not exist irrespective of her duties as a federal office holder, and therefore the campaign's payment of those expenses would not be personal use. Draft B, on the other hand, concludes that campaign funds may not be used in those same scenarios because Congresswoman Barragan's obligation to ensure adequate elder care would exist irrespective of her duties as a federal office holder, and therefore the payment of such expenses with campaign funds would be personal use. We received no comments on the request and one comment on the draft, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much to the Office of General Counsel. Colleagues, let me open it up. If there are questions for OGC or questions for counsel for the requester. Mr. Dickerson.
Thank you. I appreciate the requester being here. This is one of those many cases where I think at least my decision making will be very much helped by being able to ask those questions.
Oh, yeah, sorry, Commissioner Broussard?
No, I was just going to ask if thank you. It could bring it closer to the mic. It's a little difficult to hear. Thank you.
Sure, no problem at all. Thank you for interrupting so we could make that correction. So Commissioner Dickerson, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is funny because my family usually thinks my voice is too loud. So this is an unusual problem for me. So I had some questions about the scope of the request. As I'm sure counsel knows, advisory opinions are for specific transactions or activities of a person. And so I just want to have some sort of comfort in terms of what the anticipated scope of the AO would be. So there's three buckets of activity that you asked about. I'm just going to skip to the end and say that number 3 strikes me as fine under our precedent. So I don't have questions on those. But the first two, I think, are a little tricky. So let me just read the first question presented, and then I'll try to break it down with you. So the question presented, number 1, is, may Congresswoman Barragan use campaign funds to pay for gaps in her mother's caregiving when Congresswoman Barragan is in her district or traveling to other destinations for campaign events, such as fundraising events, meetings with campaign supporters, traveling with presidential and other congressional candidates, or to the national convention, I assume of her political party. So I guess my first question is, would you agree with me that under the statute, for these expenses not to be personal use, they must be either in connection with her campaign or in connection with her official duties as a member of Congress? And
Yes.
that's an or. That's to be one or the other bucket.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So then let me ask you about each of these buckets. I think I understand what a fundraising event is, but to be clear, do you mean a fundraising event specifically for her reelection, or do you mean a broader category of fundraising events?
In that case, we are talking about her fundraising events, potentially joint fundraisers with her and someone else, but not fundraisers for purely for other campaigns.
If it were as a result of a joint fundraising committee, would you expect to allocate the expenses?
Yeah, although I don't think she has any joint fundraising committees at the moment. I kind of meant if they both, yes, if they did do a joint fundraising committee, I expect that the allocation for the contributions that came in would be done according to the commission's statutes and regulations. I I haven't thought about if we did a joint fundraiser, if you'd attribute the childcare costs to both, to everyone who was in there. I hadn't given that any thought, and nor is that something the Congresswoman asked me to ask of you. I don't think that's anything she anticipates to be happening.
So then for purposes of today, and I understand that I've represented clients, I know things come up. So for purposes of today, can I interpret that as limited to her own campaign?
Yes.
Okay. The next category is meetings with campaign supporters. So I assume you don't meet in the hypothetical where my best friend lives in New York and happens to support my campaign and we go out for dinner. So can you give me a limiting gloss on the context of meetings with campaign supporters?
Yes, we were trying to come up with a way of, making it clear for the commission, and also making sure we're ensuring we knew what it covered once you gave us your advisory opinion. But there's those unique situations that come up for office holders all the time. Oh, the supporters want you, you have some supporters in, San Diego, and she can drive down from LA and they have a meeting about an issue, about a campaign thing, a fundraising event, just a get out the vote kind of thing where supporters are there. I recognize that it's a little bit vague, but I think it is not the scenario in which, we fly off and meet our best friend in New York City. This would be, official campaign events where we're meeting with people who give to her campaign, people who have supported in the past, people who knock on doors, volunteers, that sort of thing.
Mr. Chairman? Yes. So again, this would be limited to, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but activities directly connected to her own reelection campaign effort in her district.
Correct.
So that takes us to traveling with presidential or other congressional candidates. One, I mean, kind of back to that two bucket problem. I understand and appreciate that, or at least I think that you are trying to organize your questions in subsection 1 and subsection 2 to account for that distinction. What do you have in mind by traveling with other candidates?
She's gotten opportunities to do campaign events or things for the party, where a bunch of officers get together to do some sort of events for, president or, in this case, like the national parties, that sort of thing. We're trying to capture all things that might happen so that we feel like we're giving you all the information. Obviously, we don't know all the opportunities that will come about. But obviously, during an election year, there tends to be more opportunities for traveling to events or participating things with other candidates, right? Including, especially if it's a presidential election year.
Mr. Chairman? Yes. Well, I mean, I think that gets to the heart of my kind of concern, which is opportunities for travel is a pretty broad bucket. And, to the extent, and that raises two concerns, which I'm curious as to your reactions. One concern is the extent we're talking about opportunities for travel, that just may not be a specific enough activity or transaction to merit an advisory opinion under the statute. And the other is opportunities for travel may not be sufficiently connected to her own reelection campaign. I won't speak for my colleagues, but for me to feel comfortable providing the immunities of an advisory opinion. So to the extent that you've got a limiting gloss on that, I'd be curious to hear it, having, I think, shown my cards.
Yeah, I think, it's tough to say exactly what, as I said before, what is going to happen. But there are a number of different types of opportunities that happen. And when the Congresswoman feels when she gets to travel with other candidates or get on the national stage or go to a larger event that is not just a direct fundraiser for her in particular, that impacts her own campaign in terms of visibility, in terms of potential votes, in terms of potential contributors. And so while it may not be a campaign event for the Congresswoman, it is in connection with her campaign, understanding, your point of view that you need to draw some lines in order for, to get specific. I think that's what I've got.
Fair enough. Let me ask actually the harder question, which I may get at the same issue, which is attendance at the, I presume, Democratic National Convention. How is that in connection with her campaign, concretely?
I think in a number of ways. It means getting to meet at the national convention with supporters who are already her supporters, meeting new people, being able to shake hands, potentially meeting new contributors, potentially meeting people who could come back to her district and assist her either on a campaign level or, assist with fundraising. And it allows you to become part of and be involved in the party that, you represent when you go to Congress.
Mr. Chairman? Yes. And then I'll step aside. I see my colleague had some questions. I think we're back to my allocation question. Like, even if I grant that there's going to be, and I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that there will be some activities that occur at the National Convention that are reasonably closely connected to the Congresswoman's reelection campaign and her status as a candidate. It seems to me there's probably going to be a lot of things that are not, either that are, purely social or which are directed generally at the Democratic Party as opposed to her particular candidacy. What's your view of how one would break that down? Or is the request basically, no, we want 100% pay for expenses incurred irrespective of attendance at the convention, irrespective of whether those activities are directly tied to her candidacy?
I think that's a good question. I do want to remind the commission that we are only asking to use these funds when there are gaps in care, right? So her mother has continuous care, and if all goes well, we don't need to use campaign funds at all. So the reason we're trying to get as broad as possible is because there could be, so you attend the convention and all is fine until the last evening, and you can't get home in time to be the one who care gives. Can we use campaign funds? So I recognize wanting to have some kind of bright line rules here. But definitely, what we're not saying is if she does all of these activities, 100% of her mother's care is being paid for by campaign funds. We're only doing when someone doesn't show up for their shift or, the worker gets ill, that sort of thing. But to your point, it's not clear, right? It's not specifically bright line because campaigns, they morph. We do all sorts of things when we're running for office to ensure that we're going to get reelected or help other people get reelected. And so it's hard to say these are all the scenarios in which we're going to do it. We tried to do the best that we could in there. I recognize that at midnight, that bright line would be really nice. And sometimes it's just in making this request as realistic as possible, we wanted to kind of explain all of the scenarios we thought it might come up. And then it may not end up coming up in many of these as well. Again, recognizing too that other people will be reading it. So we need to have some sort of clear guidance. I don't know if I can give it to you.
No, I appreciate that. Just to respond to that, one, the actual category of expenses, the caring for her mother versus caring for a child, I'm completely untroubled by that. So that's not, I think, for me at least, the legal issue here. For me, the legal issue, and I voted this way previously, is that to the extent the statute talks about expenses irrespective of one's candidacy, I think that distinction between, to use your words, getting yourself elected versus helping get other people elected is a legal distinction. And so, the answer to that question is, in my view, going to be material to how you would end up being able to pay for it. Thank you.
Commissioner Lindenbaum.
Thank you. I will say off the bat that I am struggling with this one. I think some of my colleagues may be as well. And it's for a few reasons. It is not because of any differences between childcare and, dependent care. Although at least there are some, factual differences that may come up for people that are not your client, because with your client, she is her legal guardian, right? There's a different issue that could come into play if somebody is not someone's legal guardian. But I recognize, again, that's not the facts here. This is an advisory opinion. It's based on the facts in front of us. I wasn't here when many of these, advisory opinions were issued on childcare and, you can just say care. And the reasoning behind this and this irrespective test that we have really put into place here. But I struggle with, is that too broad of a way to look at this, especially when, the way this started was with a candidate, not a sitting member. A sitting member has a salary that they get while they're campaigning. They don't have to quit their job to campaign like most, candidates do. So they have the salary. They have their, members' representative allowance to also dip into for many of their costs when other people don't. And I'm trying to understand. I understand the legal side of it, but on a policy side of it, why does it make sense for us to, absolutely okay this and say that, yes, campaign funds can be used here?
I think that's a good question. And I think as we're seeing Congress change and the world change in terms of how things are happening, we have, in Congresswoman Berrigan's case, she doesn't have a spouse who also can kind of pick up that slack. And, we're seeing, the members of Congress getting elected to, look different, right? They've got young kids, as we've talked about with childcare, with unique circumstances. They have to file, and in case of many of my clients, they've got to fly back and forth all the way to California, right? So that's a significant time period in which you can't get back necessarily to, do the caring or that sort of thing. And we're seeing this change, especially if you're getting younger members of Congress who may be part of a sandwich generation, or that, have responsibilities for parents or kids or things. And it makes it, having those, campaign funds that were, raised for that purpose and given by their supporters, to assist with that. I think as a policy matter, it helps to support those folks who are running and being able to keep their seats.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
So, again, I understand that. And that may be a reason to raise the salary for members, but I'm trying to understand, we're not giving tax advice, of course. And, even if we approve this, I can't tell you whether or not your client should be paying taxes on any money that comes in here and that she uses on the elder care. But assuming this is, non-taxed money, why? Is that something that you think should happen here, where we can use this campaign funds for somebody who already receives the salary?
I mean, I think that's, the case for, many of the things that the FEC takes up in terms of particular travel or childcare expenses, like we mentioned before, where if it's determined that it's not personal use, that it's, an okay use of campaign funds. And, I mean, I suppose that could be said for, other things that happen. We know that I know the commission is taking up, spending campaign funds on security, right? And that may relate, to running for office or not running for office, and they get a salary, they could pay for security, with their salary, right? So I think we do have to, as you were saying, as a policy matter, make some determinations here, and I don't envy you in doing it, and I understand. But I also feel really, what's really tough for my client in this particular situation is she's established making sure that her mother's taken care of, using programs that are already available, and she's used her own funds in the past and her own ability to do the caregiving too. And it's gotten to the point where there's just gaps that she cannot cover because of her status as a candidate and an office holder. Hence the reason, I think it makes a decent case that she should be able to use it that way.
Mr. Chairman, it's unfortunate since so many of us are in that situation, not because we're candidates or office holders, but because we have childcare responsibilities, elder care responsibilities, and we're actually not in a position to change the system such as it exists. So back to more of the legal side of it, one of the challenges I'm also thinking through is what is a member's duty, and should we, if we okay this, should we set limitations on what somebody's duty is as an office holder? Is it just, the couple hours that they may vote, right? When they're in town, they're spending very little time voting, right? Is it also the time that they spend fundraising for others, which while may not be their actual office holder duty, it helps them climb the leadership ladder? Is this something that you think we should leave up to the candidate office holders to make that determination themselves, and then they are therefore responsible to their voters and their donors on how they spend that money? What's the best way to do this?
Yeah, I think that's something we, in this field deal with all the time, right? To an extent, you can make a bright line rule so that everyone can say that is okay and that is not. Makes it easier to ensure folks are following the rules. And if not, it's fairly easy to see, that you can open an enforcement action, for instance, or investigate. On the other hand, while I was going through this process with the staff, who is amazing, by the way, it was tough to be able to make sure we were covering all the bases and ensuring that we came up with the scenarios that were like, these are the specifics where we're going to need that gap in care, and, to do the best we can, and to know there's going to be unique situations. So, either of these, drafts, if other people, it's pretty specific. So knowing that, you may take up regulations in that sense may be the most helpful way of going through and coming up with those specifics and getting input from the public in that case for other scenarios other than this specific one, which is pretty factually specific.
Final thing. And thank you for that again. And thank you for this, in this advisory opinion request, you are giving us a lot of factual details here that help us, or at least help me here, maybe be able to say yes, but on these facts and the fact that this is for gaps in care, not the regular care that exists. And to the extent I approve this, it will be for those purposes. And I'll pass it on to my colleagues.
Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to the requester, because I think thank you for the question. I think it is a difficult question for us, but you are providing us with an opportunity here to provide some clarity on a point on which I think we all agree. And that is that, it happens that all of the previous questions that came in concerned childcare. But I think that we are probably unanimous in agreeing that whatever we have said about the payment of childcare expenses in the past applies equally to other caregiving responsibilities, such as elder care or caring for a disabled relative. And I really feel this request because I've been in all three of those buckets personally, and I know that all of us have lived experience that reflects some of these same concerns of needing to be there for someone who depends on you and trying to balance that with other responsibilities. So I found this this request really spoke to me, I have to say. And as I said, I think that to the extent I'm not exactly sure where everybody's going to come down, but I think there is one principle that we all agree on, and that is that whatever we have said about the payment of childcare expenses applies equally to other dependent care expenses. And I think I appreciate the opportunity for us to make that clear. The personal use statute is interestingly worded. It has what we call the irrespective test, that the payment has to be, I'm looking for the exact words of the statute. A contribution or donation shall be considered to be converted to personal use if the contribution or amount is used to fulfill any commitment, obligation, or expense of a person that would exist irrespective of the candidate's election campaign or individual's duties as a holder of federal office. And it has been suggested in the past that having to pay rent in Washington is something that a person only has to do because they're a member of Congress. Having to buy nice clothes to wear on the House floor is an expense that they would, otherwise they'd be at home wearing their sweatpants, so they wouldn't need to buy that expensive clothing. But Congress was pretty clear when it passed this law that those kinds of expenses, even though the argument could be made that it's irrespective, that wasn't what they meant. So I think there are many places where there are many requests we've received where I thought it was pretty easy to figure out whether it was personal use or not, whether it met the irrespective test. But I think this one really is a challenge. And that's why, and I appreciate my colleagues allowing us to add something to the agenda at the last minute. That's why I think this topic really would be well addressed in a rulemaking. The advisory opinion context allows you to get a shield from enforcement action. It doesn't, if we are unable to answer some of your questions, that's not a no, it's not a yes. It just means you're kind of operating at your own risk. We're not predicting how it's going to turn out should somebody file a complaint. And I think on the answer to question 1, we are all in agreement, and at the appropriate time, I would be happy to move approval of the answer to that. I'm not sure sitting here today that I feel comfortable with either draft, with the answers to the other questions. I think one may be too broad for me and the other may be too narrow for me. And even though it is based on your specific facts, I worry that draft A could open the door to members using campaign funds just to pay for their normal dependent care expenses, just because of the way that it is worded. And I don't think that's what the statute contemplates, and that's not a place that I'm ready to go to. But I think it would really benefit from public comment, from interacting with the public on the various distinctions between what candidates are doing and what office holders are doing, and what officers are doing in their candidate capacity. In some way, I think you're right that some of these questions reflect a new dynamic in Congress, but in some ways it's an issue that the Commission has been dealing with for a long time. Back in the 1990s, the Commission first started to get requests from members of Congress who wanted to use campaign funds for childcare expenses. And it's actually only more recently that we got requests specifically from non-incumbent candidates. And I think that the advisory opinions that we granted to those non-incumbent candidates set important precedents that I would not want to, I wouldn't want the fact that I'm interested in doing a rulemaking to negate that I'm considering revisiting those. I think those were rightly decided. But I think that some of the questions that you have posed really do extend what the Commission has said before. And you're perfectly entitled to ask. That's why you asked the question, because we haven't answered it before. But I think this really goes beyond where the Commission has been comfortable in the past. That's a very long-winded way of saying that I think that the answer to question 1 is pretty similar in both drafts, and I'm comfortable with that. But I'm just not comfortable today answering the other questions. I don't think either drafts hits it quite right for me, and I think we really should do a rulemaking on this, because you raise important and interesting questions.
Thank you. Commissioner Dickerson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, first, let me finish my questioning, and then I have a couple points. So I finished with question 1, and I hate to disappoint the Vice Chair, but as I pointed out, I think I could grant question 1 as limited to the Congresswoman's own campaign, but that doesn't sound like the request. So I'm in the difficult position of either having to write a narrower understanding of the first question or saying no, which is awkward. But let me ask you about question 2, which it seems to me falls on the question of what official capacity or official business is. I'm wondering if you could give me either a back of the envelope definition or a set of examples, something to give me a sense of what you mean by official capacity, because I know you're aware of the Swalwell advisory opinion, and that was a central question that arose there.
Yeah, it's something, we talked about a lot when trying to come up with the best way of asking the questions. There are just certain things. So as one of our specifics is as chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, right? So you can't be chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus if you're not a member of Congress, right? So while the caucus itself is not official duties, we, have said that it's in connection with. But you're right, and that's part of why we're asking the question, not only because, the dependent care hasn't been addressed, but because it's hard to know exactly. I mean, if you ask members of Congress, they'd be like, well, if I'm invited on a CODEL, it's because, I'm a member of Congress. If I'm chair of a caucus, it's because I'm a member of Congress. Right? Or to attend an event in their official capacity in a ceremonial role, for instance, because they're a member of Congress, they would not get those invitations being, a citizen from Los Angeles. But I understand your perspective in that it's hard to specifically narrow that down, and I sense some discomfort in allowing the member of Congress or the federal official to make that determination. I'm not sure I have a perfect definition for you.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Well, then let me just make a couple observations. One is I think the challenge on this concept of official duty is, the word duty. I mean, the Constitution gives the Congress plenary authority to set its rules and elect its officers, and I have no interest in probing too deeply into those questions, which I think are, not mine to consider. But the statute does use the word duty, and duties and opportunities are different things.
Sure.
And I think part of what's making me uncomfortable here is that the fact that one gets additional opportunities in life as a member of Congress, gets invited to things to which one would not otherwise get invited. I'm told embassy balls are nice. I don't rate highly enough to get invited, but I've heard this. I'm not sure I would consider that a duty of the office, as distinct from saying casting votes or, sort of fact-finding missions, which are contemplated by our regulations, things that are within the four corners of the role of being an office holder. And kind of similarly, and going back to my points on the first, the first question presented, it's not clear to me that rising through the ranks of the party in the House is a duty of the office. There may be an opportunity of the office or something adjacent to the office, or, I certainly think it could encompass campaigning, although we're back to my point about you might have to figure out whose campaign needs to pay for that. And it may be that the leadership PAC or the party committee or someone else has to take responsibility for the fundraising done on its own behalf rather than the Congresswoman's own reelection campaign. So, I mean, I guess my overall point is, and I don't think this is in any way yours or your client's fault. This is a result of lack of clarity from the commission going back several decades, where we haven't been careful about applying the statutory language in a way that I think is intended to be narrow. So all those points made, turning to the vice chair's proposal, Commissioner Broussard and I had a statement in the Swalwell matter. I think I find this less obscure than maybe my colleagues do. The irrespective test has the advantage of not turning in any way on the personal, situation of the requester. Commissioner Broussard in my statement said, this has nothing to do with whether you have a spouse who can fill in for you. This has nothing to do with the specifics of what your personal life looked like. This has to do with, whether that would have existed irrespective of these duties or this situation as a candidate. So while I'm sympathetic to the need for a rule of general application, I want to focus on on this particular request. And I guess my question to council is, there are portions of this that I would be very happy to vote for and which I support, but it is important to me, and I think it's compelled by law, that the advisory opinion be limited to the reelection campaign of your client, and not to general political activities for the party generally defined. And that the understanding of official action be like duties, not just, you know, things that come to you from the ether because of your privileged status as a holder of high office. So I would be happy if you were willing to give me the time to write a draft that I could vote for. But in light of this conversation, I don't think I have that draft in front of me. So my question to you, which I know you are accustomed to from your time here, is whether I may have an extension until the next open meeting of the commission to write that draft, or if you would prefer to take the vote today. Because I also recognize that under the statute, you're entitled to an answer today.
Yes, I'd obviously want to run it by my client to make sure, but I think that, you know, getting an answer as opposed to a non-answer or something that can't be agreed on is probably best. So I need to get permission, but I imagine that she would agree.
Colleagues, anything else? We are then in a position, what is our deadline as it stands at the moment?
Thank you, Chairman. Our deadline's tomorrow.
Okay, so what I would suggest, Ms. Olson, is if it's, well, you know, you don't control your client, but you could let us know by the end of today, even if the answer is, I don't have an answer yet, such that we are in a position where if we need to do something on Pally very quickly tomorrow, if you say like, you know, my client is so completely unavailable, I do not have permission to grant an extension, that would be helpful to know by the end of the day today, such that we know, okay, well then we need to vote on what's in front of us tomorrow and do that. And is that I'm seeing policy you could live with, maybe doesn't love it, but maybe you can live with that kind of scenario tomorrow, and I'll be available to sign anything to make it official if that's the case. Okay. So we're going to then hold this over pending, and we will either be holding this over to the next open meeting, or we'll be resolving this offline. So thank you very much, Ms. Olson, for all your time and for answering all of our questions, and we will follow up with you on that. Let me turn it over to the Vice Chair then on our next item on the agenda, which is the proposal to refer a rulemaking on dependent care.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think I previewed this for my colleagues by email as well as earlier in this meeting. I think that what we're seeing is that there are a lot of really interesting and nuanced issues around this topic, and that sometimes the case-by-case method works really well, and sometimes I think we may find ourselves in a situation where it's like, oh, wait a minute, so that made sense in that context, but now what does it mean in this context? And I think it really would benefit from a more global approach and from seeking comment from the public and seeing what distinctions we might want to make between candidates and office holders. Speaking of candidates as non-incumbent candidates. So for all of those reasons, I move that the commission refer to the Regulations Committee the issue of the use of campaign funds for dependent care in order that the staff may prepare a recommendation memo for the commission on options for notice and comment rulemaking. And all I'm asking for is a memo. I'm not saying, you know, start drafting an NPRM. I'm just saying I think this is a good topic for the Regs Committee to consider.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Colleagues, Commissioner Dickerson.
And just a question, because this came across my desk yesterday, I believe. What's the anticipated scope of this? Because I took the conversation at the table to be that there's no disagreement on the fact that dependent care is acceptable under the statute. So what's the issue that we want the Regulations Committee to look at?
Vice Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm sorry that I didn't give more notice of this. This sort of was an emerging thought of how to approach this. I think that, you know, as we've seen in the Swalwell AO and in this one, you know, there's dependent care under some circumstances and dependent care under other circumstances, and it depends on the circumstances, whether we think it's appropriate, whether different commissioners think it's appropriate to use campaign funds for those purposes. So it's not, while I think it might be nice to have a rule that just made it clear that dependent care means all kinds of dependents and not just children. I think that in and of itself might be nice, but I also think that it would be an opportunity to explore different kinds of scenarios and try and come up with some global rules that make sense, rather than findings like, oh, well, there was this precedent from 1997 that I guess maybe we should follow that, but does it still make sense today? You know, I just like to take a more global approach to it.
Yeah.
No, I hear that. It seems to me like the regulation proposal is a consideration of the personal use statute generally. Like these are conversations about what the irrespective test means. The actual use of the funds for dependent care is non-controversial. So the motion seems to me somewhat imprecisely targeted in that, you know, the conversation we're having is not about that prong. And as a result, the ask is actually quite a bit bigger in that, you know, a rulemaking directed to the irrespective test and the personal use prohibition generally. We just did this in candidate salaries. It took us like 2 years. So if that's what we're being asked to do, that strikes me as very different than something that's narrowly tailored, something of general agreement. That's my question.
Vice Chair.
I mean, obviously it involves the irrespective test, and I mean, that is the provision that we would be working with, is the statutory provision on personal use, and that involves an interpretation of the irrespective test. You know, there's no other way to get there other than to consider that. And this would be a consideration of, and yes, we just went through this in candidate salaries, and it would be a similar exercise of interpreting the irrespective test in light of the various scenarios that could come up involving dependent care.
Colleagues, any other debate on the Vice Chair's pending motion? Okay, seeing none, all of those in favor of the Vice Chair's motion say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No. That motion fails by a vote of 3-3. The Vice Chair, Commissioner Lindenbaum, Commissioner Broussard in favor, myself, Commissioner Trainer, and Commissioner Dickerson opposed.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
If it's not out of order to explain my vote. This is interesting. I think it's a much heavier lift than 24 hours notice can justify. I'd be curious about a more fulsomely developed plan, but I think throwing this to the regulations committee in light of all of the things that we need to deal with in our regulations is premature, but I appreciate the offer.
We are going to move to our next agenda item then, which is the draft advisory opinion 2024-10 from former Representative Alan Lowenthal and Lowenthal for Congress. And from the policy division, you have a chance to get settled. We have Mr. Lipchak here. We have one draft in front of us, and my understanding is we do not have the requester or any representative of the requester with us. So let me turn it over to Mr. Lipchak for a presentation.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, Commissioners. Agenda document 2436A is a draft response to an advisory opinion request submitted by retired Congressman Alan Lowenthal and his principal campaign committee, Alan Lowenthal for Congress. Requesters propose to use remaining campaign funds in the committee's account to pay a researcher or editor to assist in drafting a book or other publication related to Congressman Lowenthal's experience in Congress. Requesters propose 3 different scenarios regarding whether proceeds from the publications are received and how the proceeds would be used. Requesters ask whether remaining campaign funds may be used to pay a researcher or editor to assist Congressman Lowenthal draft a book or other publication during his retirement. This draft concludes campaign funds may not be used as proposed because the payment to hire the researcher or editor would be an expense that exists irrespective of Congressman Lowenthal's status or duties as a candidate or office holder. And thus, would constitute the personal use of campaign funds in each of the proposed scenarios. We've received no comments on this request and no comments on the draft. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, are there any questions for policy or any points of discussion? Seeing none, then let me put a motion on the table with respect to draft advisory opinion 2024-10, former Representative Alan Lowenthal. I move approval of agenda document number 24-36-A, which is draft A. Colleagues, is there any debate on that motion? Seeing none, all of those in favor say aye. Aye. All right, that motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much to policy. We're going to move then to our third and final draft advisory opinion on this agenda, which is draft advisory opinion 2024-12 from Mr. Sean McCutcheon. And we have Ms. Rufner from the policy division. We also have counsel from the requester here, Mr. Backer. If you could come up to the table, we'd appreciate it, and we appreciate you coming in person. Ms. Rufner, whenever you are ready, if you could give us a presentation about this item.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And good morning, Commissioners. Agenda documents 24-38-A and 24-38-B contain draft responses to an advisory opinion request by Sean McCutcheon regarding Maine's 2024 election for U.S. Senate, which will be conducted using ranked choice voting. The request asks whether the first round of vote tabulation counts as a general election and whether subsequent rounds of vote tabulation, if any, count as runoff elections under the Federal Election Campaign Act, and thus should be given separate contribution limits. 4 candidates have qualified to appear on the ballot, which means there will be a maximum of 3 rounds of vote tabulation. The requester wishes to contribute $9,900 or $3,300 for each round to a particular candidate, with the second and third $3,300 contributions being refundable should the candidate not qualify for those rounds. Both drafts conclude that the individual rounds of vote tallying in Maine's ranked choice voting system do not qualify as separate elections under the Act. Rather, the entire ranked choice voting process, including all necessary rounds of vote tallying for Maine's 2024 U.S. Senate general election, constitutes a single election, currently subject to a $3,300 contribution limit per individual. The Act and Commission regulations define a general election as an election held in even number of years on the Tuesday following the first Monday in November. Here, only a single election will be held, with voters casting ballots on Tuesday, November 5th, 2024. Maine's ranked choice voting system will tabulate votes over the course of several rounds, but the request does not indicate, and the Commission is not aware of any date after November 5th prescribed by Maine law on which voters will be able to cast votes in this election. Under the plain language of the Commission's regulations, this election is thus a general election. The Commission received 2 comments on this request and 1 comment from Requesters Council on the draft AOs. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you very much. Colleagues, let me open it up for questions or discussion. Commissioner Lindenbaum.
Thank you. I don't have any questions, but I do just want to notice one of the comments that we received. We received comments in many of these advisory opinion requests, and we appreciate all of them. I think I could say that speaking on behalf of my colleagues, but I particularly appreciate this comment we received from the League of Women Voters of Maine, Represent Us, and Fair Vote. They submitted a comment very early that explained ranked choice voting to those who may or may not be familiar with it. And that was particularly helpful, I think, in this situation to me, the staff, and hopefully to my colleagues as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Colleagues, additional question, Commissioner Trainer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Backer, thank you so much for being here today. And I've read the comments that you submitted, but I wonder if you could flesh those out a little bit and kind of tell us your opinion between the 2 different drafts that we have before us today.
Mr. Backer. Can you turn your, make sure it's green. Touch it. Right?
Okay.
There you go.
Thank
Please.
You know, from my read of the 2 drafts, I think there's only one differentiation was the citation to the Ninth Circuit case. I think we disagree with both drafts in the sense that we believe that the ranked choice vote is clearly separate federal elections, regardless of how Maine's efficient process is. They are under federal law separate elections. In terms of the comments that do you want me to go through it or? Okay. So the major concern we had is that the objections to the request seem to fall in a couple of categories. One is that, well, you can't practically spend money, but I think without going into too much detail, it doesn't really matter. Whether or not you can practically, exercise a right doesn't preclude the fact that you have a right. And then we did come up with suggest a few possible uses for funds that would be consistent with the act in the event that we are correct that they are multiple elections. The second is this question of, well, the election occurs November 5th, and that's the due date, and that's the day of the election. And interestingly, I was in another matter recently where it was pointed out that something like 60% of votes now occur prior to election day. And so, in fact, election day is really just the last day of an election process. But ultimately, the statute itself doesn't preclude a runoff election occurring on election day. It simply talks about the fact that the first election has to happen on that day, the general election. It doesn't preclude the runoffs from occurring there. And then we talked a little bit about the UOCAVA voters, the Uniformed Overseas Civilian and Absentee Voter Act voters. And so in Georgia, for example, you have voters who receive a primary election ballot and a general election ballot, and it is essentially a ranked choice ballot. It asks them who their candidate is, and then it also tells them and who's your second choice in the runoff. And so in that environment, you have voters who are casting both of these votes at one point. But it's the fact that voting process, the act of voting occurs when it occurs and only occurs at one time, does not mean that those two separate elections are one individual election. Because ultimately, an election is the selection of candidates, a group of candidates by the voters. And this RCV process, while a very, very efficient system, and I don't dispute Maine's right to have an efficient process here, it is a series of decisions between different groups of candidates and different people casting votes. And again, the efficiency of that process doesn't change that under federal election law. It is, in fact, two separate elections. I was thinking on the ride over here this morning that one of the interesting problems that you have here is that nobody was thinking about this when they drafted the law or the regulations. And RCV as a concept, whether or not it's good or bad, is sort of irrelevant. It's the states have the right to set up their processes, but they're shoehorning a state process into the federal regulatory framework doesn't alter that federal regulatory framework that sets what an election is. And somewhat jokingly, if a legislature were to say we define election as the governor selecting a candidate for office, that is still, they're defining an election that way, but no one would think that's actually an election. And certainly, obviously, it would be subject to challenge, but it wouldn't change the nature of our statutes. Similarly, if over in Vermont, they were to decide we're going to redefine our election process and change the name to maple syrup surprise, it's still an election and it's still subject to federal election law. So the way in which a state exercises its constitutional prerogative to structure and schedule its elections doesn't change the fact that you have an election amongst a group of candidates with votes being cast, and then a subsequent vote. There's a subsequent election of different group of candidates with different sets of voter. And so we think that this is clearly a sequence of elections. Obviously, it wasn't intended by the folks in Maine. I don't think anyone really thought about it, and it's clearly not envisioned within the statute when it was written. But as a practical matter, as I hate to say it, as a practical matter, it is what the statute says. They are elections, and each round should qualify for a separate contribution.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Becker. I looked at the statute in Maine, and so I appreciate that you alluded to the Maine statute, but I wasn't able to find out what is if is there a mechanism for what happens if two candidates in the ranked choice system both come out of the first round with the exact same number of votes?
So and I'm not an attorney bar in Maine, and so that's of course not made legal advice, but my understanding is that if there's a tie for the last position, there's a coin toss in Maine. So if you have four candidates or three candidates, and two of them, one has a majority, has 40%, and the other two have 30%, exactly the same count, there's a coin toss. And then at the last vote, if there is a tie with the top two, I don't know for sure, but I think it is also a coin toss.
So even if it's you get down to two candidates,
right, and it's a flat out tie,
and it's a straight up tie.
Mm-hmm.
It is, instead of there being another election of any type, a runoff, if you will, it's just a coin toss.
I believe that's the case, but I'm not 100% certain.
Okay,
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mr. Rufner.
I don't think the coin toss for the top two would be the case. If you have 4 candidates and you're winnowing down to 3, you could choose, or you could eliminate one with a coin toss, but even if the top 2 have the exact same number of votes, you would still just move those on to the next round of tabulation.
Right, but if it were the final round and there were
Yeah.
only 2 candidates remaining and it were a tie,
Right, yeah. I do
then
think
that would also be a coin
toss.
toss decision.
Yeah, I
Is
think
our
so,
understanding.
but
I understand
I'd
that
have to
Mr.
check.
Backer is not giving us a 100% guarantee.
Well, and it was confusing for me too. That's why I asked the question. I mean, maybe somebody had a better understanding.
You know, by the way, speaking to the comment by the League of Women Voters Maine, Fair Vote, and Represent Us, you know, one thing they pointed out in their description is that you don't have to have multiple rounds. If somebody wins the election on the first round, it has a majority vote at the first round of voting, that's it, it's over. And so you're not, you know, there is no separate second calculation. And to me, I think that's a uniquely distinctive feature of the fact that you have an election, it occurs. You have a winner or you don't have a winner. And then if you don't have a winner, you're going to a runoff. Yes, it's an instant runoff. And yes, the statute is very well written the state statute is written in order to conserve state resources. I mean, we all know elections are ridiculously expensive purely from an administrative perspective. And so there's a great efficiency to be had in ranked choice voting, but under federal election law, you have an election. It has occurred, and then you're making a separate selection after that. I'm sympathetic to the idea that, well, really, wouldn't this make sense if we did it this way? And if that's how the law was to be interpreted, but that strikes me as something more appropriate for like a rulemaking process of how ranked choice, how or whether ranked choice voting rounds might perhaps be, in that statute. But as the statute is written, I think on its face, the federal statute is clear to me that it is separate rounds of voting.
And then my other question had to do with if the candidate were allowed to raise 2 sets of funds, one for the initial round of voting and then one for a second round of voting, or in this particular instance, the second round of counting, would it be practically possible to run a series of ads or mail pieces that say, vote for me, trade trainer, as your first choice? And then to target an audience who maybe I know I'm not their first choice, but for me to run a series of ads saying, vote for me as your second choice. Would I be campaigning in the 2 separate elections at that point?
So it's an interesting question, and we thought about it a bit because if it's a runoff election, you can't spend funds from a runoff election until you're in that runoff election. And so, so there is a distinction with Busby on the one hand, where you had 2 separate elections and you could ask people to write in both places. But in our view, notwithstanding the fact that you can have multiple elections on one single day, a runoff is still a subsequent election, and you shouldn't be spending dollars prior to that election in that account. In fact, I think probably the last AO on this was the Niger Innis AO that I also was on. And I believe that there's only a very limited number of expenses that you can spend preemptively the funds for a subsequent election, things like fully refundable deposits, for example. Having said that, you could contract for expenditures that are related to that period to only be paid if and when you hit that period. For example, what we referenced in our comment was the cost of auditing and monitoring that particular piece of the election, the second part of it, potential research and legal challenges to it.
Colleagues, any other questions for OGC or counsel for the requester? Okay, maybe some appropriate motions. Vice Chair?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The drafts, as has been noted, are pretty similar. I was comfortable with draft A, but I'm also comfortable with draft B. So in the interest of perhaps a better chance of success in advisory opinion 2024-12 McCutcheon, I move approval of agenda document number 24-38-B, otherwise known as draft B.
Thank you very much for that, Vice Chair. I appreciate that expeditiousness. Colleagues, is there any debate on that motion to approve draft B? Okay, seeing none. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no.
I'm abstaining, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, well, that motion is going to carry by a vote of 5-0. Myself, Commissioner Dickerson, Commissioner Lindebaum, Commissioner Broussard, and the Vice Chair in favor, and Commissioner Trainer having abstained. thank you very much to Council for the Requesters for your time. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
We're going to move next to Regulation 2024-01, Candidate Security Draft, Final Rule, and Explanation and Justification. Mr. Lipchak is back with us. Thank you very much, sir. If you could give us a brief presentation about this item that's in front of us.
Thank you, Chairman. Before you is Agenda Document 2440A, a draft final rule and explanation and justification regarding the Commission's amendment to its regulations on the use of campaign funds to pay for security measures for federal candidates and office holders. These final rules will codify several Commission advisory opinions that authorize the use of campaign funds to pay for certain security measures and address additional issues raised in those advisory opinions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lipchak. Colleagues, any questions for OGC or comments anyone wants to make? Not, I'll just say thank you to Mr. Lipchak for all of your work on this over what's been about a year, I think, that we got this initiative started. I really appreciate Policy's great work. I also want to thank all the commissioners who worked on this, Commissioner Broussard on the Regulations Committee, and also thank all the commenters from party committees, public interest groups, members of the public, members of Congress. Yeah, Commissioner Dickerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very briefly, I want to thank the chairman and Commissioner Broussard for their leadership on this. Honestly, less about the substance of the rule than about, this is what good government looks like. We have a series of advisory opinions that accrete over years. The rule is familiar to insiders who are expert in these things. It's applied on a daily basis by campaigns that are well advised, but the regulations themselves don't reflect the state of the law. And I think this sort of like good government action where we take the understanding of the law that's already built up, that's already understood, that is unambiguous, and place it into the regulations book is good for notice. It fulfills this agency's responsibility to encourage voluntary compliance with the law. It's this sort of thing that I think improves confidence in government. So I'm very grateful for that effort from that larger, more holistic standpoint.
Thank you. Maybe an appropriate motion then? Oh, yeah, sorry, Commissioner Lindenbaum.
I do just want to add my thanks from the D side, I guess, since my Republican colleagues have all spoken on this. This was a really great work by the chairman and Commissioner Broussard, and this moved pretty quickly. And that's because of them and their leadership on pushing this through. And it seems quite timely now, but this was actually started earlier. So it's because of their work that we're actually at this point now. This is a critical issue. It's unfortunate that so many candidates, office holders, their family, and even their staffs are under threat. This isn't a new issue. It has been happening for quite a while. And while this is, largely outside the commission's jurisdiction, unfortunately, the only thing we can do, and the one small thing we can do, is to give these candidates, office holders, and their families and staff the ability to actually use funds to pay for them. So thank you.
Thank you. Turn over to Commissioner Trainer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In Reg 2024-01 candidate security, I would move the adoption of agenda document 24-40-A.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Trainer. Colleagues, any debate on that motion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right, that motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much to Mr. Lipchak and the entire policy division. We are going to move then next to the sixth item on our agenda, which is Regulation 2023-02, Artificial Intelligence in Campaign Ads Draft Notice of Disposition. And these are commissioner-led documents. We have representatives from the policy division, though, here, and I appreciate their availability. We have one item from the Republican commissioners, and then one item from 4 commissioners, bipartisan group of commissioners. Let me open it up to whoever wants to speak first. Otherwise, I'll have a couple brief things just to say about both these items. I have a longer version of remarks, but I'll make some condensed version of that. I guess I'll ask for unanimous consent that the full written remarks be included as part of the administrative record for this item.
No
Okay,
objection.
without objection, no, that'll be so ordered. For more than a year, advocacy groups and media outlets, members of Congress have called on the FEC to regulate artificial intelligence in political campaigns. To that end, we have a petition in front of us from Public Citizen that was filed in July of 2023, asking us to issue new regulations to ban the use of artificial intelligence to misrepresent candidates or political parties in campaign ads. Today, the commission is set to decline to do so. I think the reasons are manifold. A rulemaking that attempted to limit or prohibit the use of AI in campaign communications would not only overstep our legal authority, but it would interject this agency into a developing technology in which it has no expertise or experience. And clumsy commission regulations, I believe, would stifle AI's potential as a tool to broaden public participation in the political process. As such, such an intrusion, it risks trampling on Americans' rights to speak and to hear others speak about candidates and public issues of the day, speech that the Supreme Court has recognized as integral to the operation of the system of government established by the Constitution. So for that reason, I'm going to be supporting the original draft that's been on the agenda, which is from myself, Commissioner Trainer, and Commissioner Dickerson. I'm also going to be supporting both drafts, the one that has more limited reasoning as part of the NOD. And I really appreciate all the patience and work of my colleagues to get these documents on the agenda. I appreciate all the public for their participation in the comment period that we had last year. And with that, I'll open it back up to any other commissioner that wants to say anything. Commissioner Lindenbaum, yeah, okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you. And I'll also ask that these, the full comments that will be posted on our website also be part of the administrative record.
Without objection.
So these comments are on behalf of myself and Commissioner Broussard. Again, these are just kind of condensed versions of what is about to go on the website. So today, we took an important and bipartisan step in issuing an interpretive rule clarifying that the fraudulent misrepresentation statute and regulation are technology neutral and therefore already applying to fraudulent misrepresentation that is perpetrated using artificial intelligence assisted media. This has been a long process, and we've received over 2,000 comments from the public, representing invaluable feedback and viewpoints across the ideological spectrum. What we're doing here today provides the sought after clarity as we lead up to the 2024 elections. But our action's only a small part of the puzzle that is addressing the role of artificial intelligence in elections more broadly. Misinformation is by no means a new threat, and the increasing availability of artificial intelligence tools can amplify misinformation and expand its reach. And for example, it can exacerbate the particular threat that micro-targeted misinformation can pose to specific populations, such as Black and Brown communities or those in swing states or competitive districts. We are hopeful that Congress will move forward on proposed legislation that offers more comprehensive solutions, such as the series of bipartisan bills that were passed this summer by the Senate Committee on Rules and Administration. Many of the states have really been leading the way here in a bipartisan way to regulate in this space. But traditional regulators are not likely to stop all of the threats posed by artificial intelligence, such as its use by foreign adversaries and other bad actors to interfere with our democracy. A rogue actor bent on influencing an election is doubtful to adhere to a disclaimer requirement for its misinformation, in the same way a candidate campaign is likely to for a negative advertisement against his or her opponent. For these types of threats, we need a whole of society approach, and the American intelligence agencies have a significant role to play in identifying and publicizing known threats and combating those rogue actors. We also have roles to play, and by we, I mean we as citizens, in rejecting misinformation by focusing on digital literacy and finding and promoting trusted sources of information. Finally, the bipartisan nature of these efforts to regulate is paramount. Political attacks leveraging artificial intelligence routinely crosses the aisle against both political parties. These bipartisan threats require bipartisan solutions, and the Commission's actions today are the result of hard work and collaboration with our colleagues, Commissioner Alan Dickerson and Commissioner Trey Trainer. The proposed federal legislation referenced above are also bipartisan efforts and are state measures from states both red and blue. So again, thank you to my colleagues. This has been an interesting year in this. And I'm also really, truly grateful for all the commenters. And I hope that those regulating in this space will also read those comments. So thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, anyone else? Vice Chair?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with pretty much everything that my colleague just said. I believe that we should do the rulemaking. I may be alone in that. And I say that with no disrespect to the interpretive rule. You know, that's actually not quite where we are in the agenda yet, but I intend to support the interpretive rule. I appreciate my colleagues' efforts on that. But I still think that my first choice always was to do rulemaking. So at an appropriate time, and I will have more fulsome comments in writing, which I suppose we don't usually do this, but you know, if we want to make a formal, make it formally part of the administrative record, then I suppose I will ask that my comments also be the written comments that I will issue later today will be made part of the administrative record.
Without objection, so ordered.
But as I said, at the appropriate time, I would like to make a motion, which maybe I'll be the only one to support, to start a rulemaking.
Sure. So I think that the appropriate time would be before the NODs then. So whether are there any other colleagues who wish to be recognized or who have any, I'll also have questions. Go ahead, Commissioner Dickerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have not prepared a substantial public statement for inclusion in the public record, but I understand that my comments here are part of the administrative record, so I will limit myself to that. You know, I spoke in the last matter of confidence in government, and this is something I believe in pretty strongly, is that confidence in government is helped when administrative agencies are forthright about the limits on their authority. And, you know, I thank the policy staff for all their engagement with this. I thank my staff for drafting the documents that it looks like are going to pass today. But I do want to say, I don't think this was a hard question. You know, there's very little disagreement on what the law actually is. The request asked for a rule that would say that the use of deepfakes is a violation of our statute. Our statute is limited to a particular type of fraudulent misrepresentation, the fraudulent misrepresentation of campaign authority. And to my knowledge, there's unanimity on this commission that we do not have authority to go beyond that understanding of fraud at this commission. Congress could change that. It has chosen not to. There's also unanimity, as far as I understand, that provision is technology neutral. And so I'm pleased that we've been able to get to a point where we can forthrightly explain to the public what we all know the law to be. And I will just say that in terms of the confidence in this commission from the public, I hope in the future these efforts are easier, and that the engagement of the public with this commission is honest about our role in the larger conversation that takes place publicly.
Thank you. Colleagues, anyone else seek to be recognized? Vice Chair.
As my colleague did earlier, I don't want to get into an extended debate about this here, but I would just say that I'm not sure that there is entire unanimity on everything that you just said, and I just want to put a pin in that.
Thank you. Okay, maybe time for appropriate motions or several appropriate motions. I'll turn it over to the Vice Chair first.
I think I probably have to go first. On the right page in my notes. Okay. With respect to Reg 2023-02, artificial intelligence in campaign ads, I move that the commission open a rulemaking and direct OGC to draft a notice of proposed rulemaking for consideration by the Regulations Committee and the full commission.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair. Colleagues, any debate on that motion? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
No.
No. Any abstentions? 1, 2. Okay, so that motion fails by a vote of 1 to 3. The vice chair in favor, myself, Commissioner Trainer, Commissioner Dickerson opposed, Commissioner Broussard, and Commissioner Lindenbaum abstaining. Let me put in another motion on the table to move through these items. Let me make the motion and then I'll just make a brief explanation. So with respect to regulation 2023-02, artificial intelligence and campaign ads, I move approval of agenda document number 24-29-A, which is draft A. One of the reasons for this vote, let me just state briefly, is that one of the concerns I have is about providing sufficient reasoning for the notice of disposition. I'm going to vote for both documents ultimately, but for purposes of public explanation, for purposes of the Administrative Procedure Act, even if this vote fails, I think it's important that the vote itself be a record of how we ultimately considered and deliberated and voted on this item. So for that reason, I'm going to ask for a vote on this item. Is there any debate on that motion? Seeing none, all of those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
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 All right, that motion fails by a vote of 3 to 3. Myself, Commissioner Trainer, Commissioner Dickerson in favor. The Vice Chair, Commissioner Lindenbaum, Commissioner Broussard opposed. Further motions, Commissioner Dickerson.
Thank you. If there is not unanimity from my view, I hope there's at least a majority. I'd like to move for the documents that were previously circulated by a bipartisan group of 4 commissioners. First, agenda document number 24-29-B, that is draft B.
All right, thank you. So it's the draft notice of disposition. Colleagues, any debate on that motion? Seeing none, all of those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
All right, that motion carries by a vote of 5 to 1. Myself, Commissioner Trainer, Commissioner Dickerson, Commissioner Broussard, Commissioner Lindenbaum in favor, and the Vice Chair opposed. And then we're going to move on to the next agenda item, which is the draft interpretive rule regarding 52 USC section 30124, artificial intelligence in campaign ads. And let me turn it back over to Commissioner Dickerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll make the motion and then I'll have a point to make in its favor. I move the Commission's adoption of agenda document number 24-39A, which is the only draft.
Thank you very much. And then did you have a point? I'll turn to you for a point you wanted to
I
make.
appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I take your point of the Administrative Procedure Act. I don't think I've been shy in my view of the limits of the Commission's jurisdiction, going back to our very first consideration of this. I have tried to keep those views inside the building, but I don't think my personal opinions are obscure. That being said, I do worry about the litigation risk always of this agency, as I think my colleagues are aware. I'm not worried here, both because, I oppose the Vice Chair's motion precisely because I don't think there's a lack of clarity in the law at this point. And so accordingly, both the limited disposition and this explanation of what the law is, I think establish an adequate judicial record if there is a challenge.
Colleagues, any other debate on the motion? Vice Chair?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to my colleagues. I intend to support this. I think that, while it wasn't my first choice, I think it is a positive step forward, and I appreciate the efforts of 4 of my colleagues who worked together to negotiate the language, which I think is accurate. And there's nothing in there that I disagree with. So I'm happy to support it, and just stop there. I'm happy to support it, and I will.
Thank you. Colleagues, any other debate? Let me make one point then, sorry. Everybody's getting ready to vote and turning on their microphones. This will be very brief. I'm not going to be able to support the interpretive rule. I just want to very briefly explain why. I don't have any written remarks to submit to explain that vote. My objection is not based on the content of the statement of the interpretive rule, which I think is true. The Commission has a technology neutral statute that prohibits fraudulent misrepresentation of campaign authority. It doesn't say how, and therefore by its silence includes all means by which that can be accomplished, and that includes AI. We do not need to, and we are not changing any rules, changing any regulations, changing any substance of the law. There's nothing that is going to be made illegal by this interpretive rule tomorrow that isn't already illegal yesterday. My concern with it is really sort of the vehicle, and my hope really that that it is taken for what it is, but that there may be an unintentional effect of confusing the public about what the commission is actually doing through this interpretive rule. I think the part of that risk is evidenced in what I've seen in sort of some of the press coverage of the document itself, which I think reflects a lack of careful reading of what it says. I mean, in one initial report by Bloomberg, it described the interpretive rule to mean that political candidates will be barred from using artificial intelligence to impersonate an opponent's voice or likeness in campaign ads. That's wrong. That story was later updated. Others have described the document, the interpretive rule, as extending fraud prohibitions to new kinds of ads that include AI. I think that's also wrong. So my fear is that less than 7 weeks out from an election, that while I think the interpretive rule is true and it's within the four corners of it, I just worry that it will be misinterpreted, misunderstood, have a potential chilling effect on people who might think it's prohibiting something new when in fact it's not. And so for that reason, I'm not going to be able to support today, although again, I support the content of it. Commissioner Dickerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe some of the reporting also quoted the vice chair as calling this a Republican-controlled panel, which I'm quite certain she didn't say. So to the extent that, which is also untrue, to the extent that, you know, we're dealing with the evergreen problem of inaccurate coverage of this commission, I think that would it would make it very hard to do our jobs if that was the basis for our voting on a regular basis. So that said, you know, I appreciate you as a fellow traveler, at least on the law, if unwilling to vote for this particular document. And I'm going to just hope that the press takes its responsibility seriously and accurately reporting what we're doing today.
Vice Chair.
I do not envy any reporter who's actually trying to explain this to the public, what we're doing here today, because I do think it's a little bit confusing. We just declined to open a rulemaking and yet we're issuing an interpretive rule. So did the agency issue a rule today or didn't it? This goes into the fine points of the Administrative Procedure Act, and the document is not a new rule. It is an interpretation of existing statute and rule, but I thought that was worth saying because I feel like in light of bad reporting or just confused reporting, and I really didn't say that, it might need some clarification.
Commissioner Lindenbaum.
I'm not sure what's going on with my colleagues right now. I think it's 11:30 and everyone's a little bit punchy. So let's just be really, really clear about what has happened here. 4 of us have been working together on this to make sure that we could give a clear answer to the public and to the requester in this petition when they asked if artificial intelligence, generative AI used in fraudulent misrepresentation per our statute applies. And we said, yes. The statute is technology neutral. So I think we have given a very clear response today. 4 of us have been working together. This is one of those instances where the FEC has worked. And I am grateful to my colleagues here. And I'm very much looking forward to voting and for us to stop talking now. So thank you.
Colleagues, we have a pending motion still. So I'll form this as a question, any further debate on Commissioner Dickerson's pending motion. Commissioner Broussard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have remarks. The remarks that were read by Commissioner Lindenbaum reflect how I feel on this. This has been a pragmatic effort today. And I think if anyone follows what I do, I believe in pragmatism in the law, that we can accomplish something that even if it might not be everything that I want. But I appreciate comments that might have been misstated from the press read. I would just like to say that I think overall, we've had more engagement in the press on this than I think that the commission should. When it comes to rulemakings, I'm about doing the work that we need to do. We've accomplished something today. I think it is a very good accomplishment. And I think once we all focus on moving forward and what the purpose of good government is, we can get a lot more accomplished today. So I am prepared to vote. I thank the vice chair for explaining what she meant, understanding the draft interpretive rule. I think that's the factor of a poor name for it to help the public understand what it's doing. But whenever the chair is ready to call this for a vote, I'll be happy to put that in. Thanks.
Thank you. Colleagues, any further debate on Commissioner Dickerson's pending motion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No. That motion carries by a vote of 5-1. Commissioner Dickerson, Commissioner Trainer, the Vice Chair, Commissioner Lindenbaum, and Commissioner Broussard in favor, and myself opposed. All right, that exhausts our substantive agenda for today. So let me ask Madam Acting Staff Director, are there any management or administrative matters we need to discuss?
Mr. Chairman, there are no such matters.
Thank you so much. This meeting is going to stand adjourned.
And bye.